Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about books that I have recently finished reading. I'm going to be talking about two of them in this episode. Two of them or they are both, I should say, Historathon picks. Historathon is a year-long celebration of nonfiction history, and we split the year up into 4 quarters. We are currently in the last month of the year now. It is quarter 4, and we are looking at the years 1820 to the present. So the two books that I read for at least so far this quarter, or this month for this quarter, is The Butchering Art by Lindsey Fitzharris and Sherman's March in Myth and Memory by Edward Caudill and Paul Ashdown. So I'll talk about these in the order in which I read them. So first, The Butchering Art, which I love that cover and that design. Now, in November, for Nonfiction November, I had read Mary Roach's Stiff. Her look at, the subtitle is The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers, and it looks at the use of bodies. And it was a fun read, and it did kind of whet my appetite for medical history. So I had to sit on my shelf for a long time. And also there is a fellow booktuber and also a participant in Historathon, Tahlia. Hopefully I'm remembering the name right. I think it's Tahlia Nerds Out is the booktube channel, I think. I'll leave a link for it down below. I hope I'm not misremembering. But she had read this also for quarter 4 of Historathon, and she really, really liked it. So I figured, this has been sitting on my shelf for a long time. I might as well get to it now. And I'm glad that I did. I really, really like this. So this is a medical history, and it's about Joseph Lister, a mid-19th century surgeon who revolutionizes medicine. In particular, he revolutionizes surgery, but it has huge repercussions all across the medical field. The title, The Butchering Art, really refers to the way surgery was in the first half of the 19th century. And this painting that you see here on the cover, it's called the Gross Clinic, and was painted contemporary to Joseph Lister, and it is pretty illustrative of the way surgery was done back in the really early to mid 19th century. So you can see these guys digging in. There's no gloves being used, no antiseptics or anything like that. And to be a surgeon, you really were a butcher. The surgeons who were most revered were those who could operate quickly. So you were judged not necessarily by the longevity of your patient, but how quickly you could remove a leg from the hip. If you could do it in less than a minute successfully, you were a great surgeon. And that's understandable for the most part. In the early part of that century, there was no ether, so people were conscious when you were removing their limbs. But you wanted to make it as painless as possible, and you were cutting through arteries, so, closing off those arteries and, basically surviving, making so that the patient could live. That was obviously a major skill for a surgeon. The problem was that all too frequently, even if the surgery was a success, within a few weeks, their patients would often die of disease because they did not understand, or some of them did not believe in, germ theory. So surgical areas were absolutely disgusting, using the same blood-crusted aprons. Sometimes these surgeons would, they would basically go from performing an autopsy to delivering a baby and then going to a surgery and never washing their hands in between. So they didn't really understand the way that diseases, basically went from person to person. So all they knew was that diseases would run rampant throughout these hospitals. These hospitals, again, were absolutely disgusting. They were places of filth and disease. And these guys had the best intentions. Now, Joseph Lister comes along and he changes things, in part because he does have a little bit of a different background. So, he's Quaker. That's not exactly it, but his father did encourage him in certain scientific endeavors, especially with the microscope. So most surgeons and people in medicine back then did not really think much of the microscope. They didn't think it would be very useful to surgery or medicine, mostly because a lot of them either didn't have a lot of experience with microscopes, or the experience they did have were with subpar microscopes, where the images were all very purplish or they were blurry. Joseph Lister grew up with very good microscopes, and he knew how to use them. And that's one of the ways that he ends up really being able to pinpoint germ theory as that which spreads the disease. And he comes up with various antiseptic um, methods in order to keep the disease from spreading. And it takes a while for people to catch on to what he's doing, to really believe him. He has to fight for it in a lot of ways. But he does get a devoted following, and of course, he does end up completely revolutionizing medicine. And aside from that, this was a really compelling story. The medical history, the people involved, Lister's life. At one point, his sister arrives. At this point, I think he's English, but he's spending a lot of his career in Scotland. And his sister arrives, and she has a cancerous mass on her breast, and he's really the only one who can successfully remove this tumor. And to operate on a family member like that, somebody who is very dear to you, to basically carve them up, and then it gets to the point where he's even operating on the Queen. You can easily imagine a terrific movie being played out with all of this. And really, it makes me so thankful for having anesthesia these days, and the descriptions of some of the surgeries that would happen are just absolutely gut-wrenching in a lot of ways. But this was a terrific read. I really like this. Certainly for quarter 4 of Historathon, this is definitely one of my favorite reads so far. Really glad I read it. I would highly recommend it. And then I followed it up with this one, Sherman's March in Myth and Memory. So this was actually part of a 3-part series. This was published by, let me just see, Roman Littlefield. I don't know if this was a university publication. I guess it wasn't. But it was essentially looking at the historical memory of, there were 3 different books by about 3 different figures. There is Nathan Bedford Forrest, there was John Mosby, and then we have Sherman, and of course specifically Sherman's March. And essentially, the first part of the book is a very brief history of the event and the person. And then it is organized thematically in its chapters by how various media or segments have remembered, chosen to remember the event. And this could be literature, it could be the reporters at the time even, film, and even later on, people like reporters or journalists who were following the path of the march, generations later, and writing about it. So it's all these different ways that people have remembered and tried to come to terms with the march. And there were some interesting things that came out of this, especially, Sherman is somebody who, of course, has a dark reputation, especially in the eyes of many Southerners. One of the things they get to at this is that, his bark was worse than his bite. He spoke very harshly, but his march, especially to the sea, from Atlanta to Savannah, was not excessively terrible. There are many sites across places like Georgia that claim to have been destroyed by Sherman and his army when they were more than 100 miles actually from where Sherman's army actually went. Yes, they were destructive as an army, but they were actually, they showed a lot of restraint also. When they go from Savannah to Columbia, there is more destruction. But some of that is kind of beyond Sherman's control. Maybe some of it not. But either way, his legend as this destroyer really is overblown. And a lot of it really has to do with the fact that he doesn't just beat the South. He beats them he cuts right through the heart of the South without much resistance. They don't really have a great force to go against him. He's basically hurting the masculine pride of the South as he goes through, and is just cutting through them unchecked. And that is probably what hurt them the most. It was the destruction of the Southern pride rather than the destruction of property. Although, of course, property did get destroyed. And it traces the way that various people in the North and the South talked about and remembered Sherman. Of course, in the South, he is often remembered as, something of a butcher. He is representative to many in the South, at least then, as the Northern industrial might. Very unfeeling, logical, and clinical, without this kind of cavalier chivalry that the South was so fond of. And in the North, he's kind of revered in maybe sort of the same way as being practical. Practical, victorious person who, the North was very endeared by his somewhat rough manner, but the fact that he'd wear these rumpled uniforms and had very plain way of speaking and chomping a cigar. And you come out of this. Well, I come out of it not exactly knowing what to think of Sherman personally. There's definitely some things about him that are very disagreeable. But he's one of those generals that lived far longer than the others. He outlasted Grant and all them, so he had a lot of time to actually speak on his own behalf after the war and give speeches and all of that. I did not know about his son. His son is discussed in here. His son was very much, I guess he kind of adopted his father's worst traits, and he was also in something of an opposite of his father. His father was pretty indifferent towards religion, but his son became a Jesuit, and he became a very zealous one, it seems, and one that was very hard to get along with, very intolerant. So this was certainly very interesting. I can't say that it was always a page-turner. There were some sections that were a little bit dry, although these authors do sometimes show some very nice turns of phrase that kind of catch you by surprise, because you'll have multiple pages where it's just very kind of dry academic writing, and then all of a sudden they have a really clever little line thrown in there. I kind of wish there was a little bit more of that, a little more engaging writing. So this isn't one that I would say people have to rush out and read. It's not going to be one that's going to, that's going to keep them turning the page and wanting more and more and more. But I did like it. I am glad that I read it, of course, and a fascinating topic. And I chose this especially because in November, I was reading books about historical memory regarding the Civil War. I had read one about ghost tours in the Deep South and their depictions of especially female slaves and of the Civil War era. And I also read one about the way the Civil War was shown in film and in fine art from the late 80s up to the early 2000s. So historical memory is something I have an interest in, and especially when it comes to the Civil War. And I had this sitting on my shelf. I think I had gotten this at maybe a Goodwill. Every so often, my Goodwill has some really interesting finds, and this was one of them. And I thought, I'm going to keep that going, that Civil War memory theme going, and might as well pick this up. So these are two books that I read in the beginning of December for Historathon 2023 quarter one, and that is The Butchering Art and Sherman's March in Myth and Memory. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, thank you, BookTube.